The moment Sheriff Calloway's gavel hit the bar counter, Harlan Doss smiled. Not the polite smile of a man following the law. The slow, satisfied smile of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. "Shut it down," Calloway said, not even looking at the women standing behind the bar. "Every last one of you, out by sundown." Harlan Doss, the man who owned half the land surrounding Copperfield and most of the town council's debts, leaned against the doorframe with his thumbs hooked into his vest. He had personally delivered the petition to Calloway's office that morning. 17 signatures. Half of them forged. But Calloway hadn't checked. Elena Ashcroft was wiping down the counter when she heard it. She set down the cloth. She did not cry. She did not argue. She simply looked at Harlan Doss, and he smiled wider. "You've got nowhere to go, girl," he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear. "You never did." He walked out before she could answer, and standing there in the hollow wreckage of the only roof she'd had for 6 years, Elena thought, "He's right. But he doesn't know the half of what I know about him." If this story already has your attention, hit that like button right now, drop your city and country in the comments below so I can see just how far this story has traveled, and make sure you subscribe and follow along so you don't miss what happens next. Stories like Elena's don't come around often. Stay with me until the very end. The notice had been nailed to the saloon door 3 days earlier, but Elena had told herself it wouldn't hold. Official documents came and went in Copperfield. Most of them were written by men with agendas and ignored by men with sense. She had watched 6 years of frontier politics move through that barroom like weather. Loud while it lasted, gone before it settled. She had been wrong this time. By 4 in the afternoon, Deputy Gideon Hale stood at the front of the Dusty Rose with the formal closure order in his hand, reading it line by line the way he read everything, slowly, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable if he gave them enough time. They didn't. "This is county stamped," he said finally. He looked up at Elena. "I can't override it." "I'm not asking you to," Elena said. He frowned. That wasn't the answer he'd been expecting. Most people in Copperfield, when they were losing something, told Gideon exactly why it was his fault. It was part of the job he'd been slowly learning since Calloway pinned the deputy's star to his chest 4 months ago. People blamed the man holding the paper even when the paper came from someone else's hand. "You have somewhere to go?" he asked. "Not presently." He folded the closure notice and put it in his coat pocket. "The Hennessy boarding house takes women. Mrs. Hennessy told me last Tuesday she doesn't take saloon women." Elena kept her voice flat. Not angry, just precise. Her exact words were that she runs a respectable house for respectable ladies, and that I ought to consider that distinction carefully. Gideon looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. "She said that." "She did. Then she closed the door while I was still standing on her porch." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, 2 of the other women who worked at the Dusty Rose were loading their belongings onto a wagon somebody's cousin had lent them. They were heading to Millhaven, 20 miles east, where another saloon was rumored to be hiring. Elena had been invited. She hadn't decided yet. She wasn't sure Millhaven would be any different. 20 miles east was still Harlan Doss's county. "The Morrison place?" Gideon tried again. "Full. Pastor Greeley has rooms at the—" "Gideon!" She said his name the way you stop a man from running through a list he already knows is empty. "I've asked. I'm not too proud to ask. Every door in this town is currently closed to me, and I would appreciate it if you didn't make me say that out loud more than once." He looked at her for a long moment. Elena was 31 years old and had the kind of face that had probably been pretty, once in a way that didn't require any effort, but 6 years in a frontier saloon had given it a different quality. Not harder, exactly. More settled, like a piece of wood that had been out in the weather long enough to become something more interesting than it started. "Pack your things," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "Your bag. Pack it. Whatever you're bringing." He picked up his hat from the bar counter where he'd set it down. "Come home and eat supper." Elena stared at him. "You can't be serious." "I'm the least sarcastic man you'll ever meet," he said, which was true enough that she almost laughed. "I've got a spare room. Nobody's used it since my mother visited 2 years ago. It's got a bed and a window. The window sticks, But you can open it if you put your shoulder into it. Gideon, people will talk. People are already talking. They've been talking since the day Calloway hired me, and I didn't immediately run you all out of town myself. He put his hat on. You need a place to sleep, and I've got a room that's empty. That's the sum of it. I'm not making you a promise, and I'm not asking you for anything. Come home and eat supper, and we'll figure out tomorrow when it's tomorrow. She looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away, but he didn't push either. He just stood there the way Gideon Hale stood everywhere, like a fence post that had been set deep and wasn't going to lean. Let me get my bag, she said. She had two things worth carrying. One was the travel bag, canvas patched at both corners with a brass clasp that didn't quite close all the way. The other was a coat, heavy wool, dark brown, cut wide through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the fact that she wore it in all weather and for reasons she never explained to anyone. She put the coat on carefully, the way she always did, right arm first, then left, easing it up over her shoulder without lifting her arm too high. A habit so practiced it had become invisible. Nobody at the Dusty Rose had ever asked about the coat. After the first year, nobody asked about anything Elena did twice. She picked up her bag and walked out into the evening. Harlan Doss was still outside. He was talking to two men on horseback, Reeves and Calder, the pair who managed his eastern range. But his eyes tracked to Elena the moment she came through the door. He watched her walk past without speaking. But he watched. Elena did not look at him. Gideon's house was on the north edge of town, set back from the road far enough that you could see the ridgeline from the front porch on a clear day. It was a square, practical house, 2 stories, unpainted because the previous owner had never gotten around to it, and Gideon hadn't seen the point of fixing something that wasn't broken. The garden alongside the house had gone mostly to weeds, but there were fence posts in the ground, which meant someone had once intended to do something with it. Elena noticed the fence posts immediately. Inside, the house smelled like coffee grounds and old newspapers and something faintly like leather from the saddle Gideon had been oiling on the kitchen table, which he now moved to the floor with visible embarrassment. I wasn't expecting company, he said. I can see that. I'm a decent cook if the thing I'm cooking is beans. Then I'll make supper, Elena said. She set her bag down by the kitchen door and looked around. There was a pantry. She opened it. Beans, yes. Also a half sack of flour, a heel of salt pork, 3 eggs, and a jar of something she couldn't immediately identify, but which turned out to be preserved green tomatoes when she opened it. You live on beans and mystery jars, she said. I've been busy, he said, defensive in the particular way of a man who has been caught being incompetent in a domestic space. Do you have lard? Somewhere. She found it behind the flour sack. She found a skillet hanging on the back wall. She put water on to boil and started moving through Gideon Hale's kitchen with the calm efficiency of a woman who had cooked for a roomful of hungry men under worse conditions than this, and within 40 minutes there was something on the table that was arguably better than beans. Gideon ate 2 full plates and didn't speak until the 3rd cup of coffee. You're going to have to tell me what you want, he said finally. Elena looked up from her cup. What do you mean? I mean, you're not the kind of woman who accepts charity and stays quiet about it. So what do you actually want? Work? A reference somewhere? Help finding another position? She turned the cup in her hands. She had good hands. Capable ones, with calluses across the palm from years of hauling trays and lifting crates. I want to know who signed the petition, she said. Gideon was quiet. The closure notice, she said. The petition that Calloway accepted. 17 signatures. I want to know whose names are on it. Why? Because I sat in that saloon for 6 years and I heard things, Elena said. I heard everything. Men talk when they think nobody worth impressing is listening, and I have a very good memory. She set down her cup. If the right names are on that petition, then whatever Harlan Doss is trying to protect by shutting down the Dusty Rose, I know what it is. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Not the look she was used to, not the appraisal, not the skepticism, not the polite dismissal. Something more careful than any of those. Let me think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. She did the dishes. He went to check on the horse. When she came upstairs to the spare room, which was exactly as described, with a bed and a window and walls that had probably been painted once in a color that had faded past identification, she stood at the window for a while and looked out at the ridge. In the morning, she would have to decide whether to stay or to go to Millhaven. She already knew what she was going to decide. She'd known it when she took the coat off and hung it on the peg by the door, and for just a moment the lamplight caught the left side of her collarbone, the silver-white ripple of scarring that ran from her shoulder up across the bone and partway down toward her chest. She put on her nightgown before the lamp went out. The window stuck. She put her shoulder into it the way Gideon had said. It opened. The air off the ridge smelled like pine and cold. She slept. In the weeks that followed, the town had opinions. Copperfield always had opinions. It was a small place with not enough to occupy itself, and the question of what exactly Gideon Hale's arrangement was with the former saloon woman living in his north bedroom window was the kind of question that could fuel a month of conversation without ever getting closer to an answer. Martha Greaves said it was scandalous, and she'd written to the county commissioner. Old Pete at the feed store said Gideon was a grown man and it wasn't anyone's business. Reverend Aldrich said he was preying on it. Harlan Doss said nothing publicly, which was more interesting than any of the above. Elena ignored all of it. She was good at ignoring things. She'd had practice. What she did instead was cook and repair and gradually impose a kind of order on Gideon's house that it had apparently never known. The fence alongside the garden went up properly. The hinges on the barn door got oiled. The pile of papers on Gideon's desk, survey maps, complaint forms, correspondence from the county land office, got sorted into stacks that meant something rather than stacks that were just the order they'd arrived in. You didn't have to do that, Gideon said when he came home one evening and found the desk in order. I know, Elena said, but I read them while I sorted. He stopped. You read my official correspondence. You didn't lock it up. It's my desk in my house. And now it's organized, she said pleasantly. She handed him a cup of coffee. The Bridger land claim, the one Harlan Doss filed last spring, there's a survey error in the original boundary description. Gideon took the coffee. He didn't sit down yet. What kind of error? The kind where the northeast corner marker puts the acreage 300 feet into what was Widow Callum's property before she sold and moved to her daughter's place, which means Doss's claim legally incorporates a strip of her former land that she sold to the Pierce brothers last fall. Elena sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. The Pierce brothers are in your complaint file for a boundary dispute with Doss's range manager. They think Doss's cattle are grazing on their land. They're right, Gideon said slowly. He was looking at her the way he sometimes did now, like he was recalculating something he'd thought he already had the measure of. I've been trying to sort out where the discrepancy started for 6 weeks. It starts in the original survey, Elena said, which was filed by a man named J.W. Aldis. I've heard that name. Aldis runs a surveying company out of Harlan Doss's South Building. He's been working for Doss exclusively for 2 years. Gideon put down the coffee cup. Where did you hear that? He asked. A man named Reeves, Doss's range manager. He and a man named Calder had a disagreement one Tuesday night, about 18 months ago, about whether Aldis was going to be a liability when it all came out. She paused. They didn't notice me because I was refilling their water glasses. Gideon sat down slowly. You remember a conversation from 18 months ago, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I remember most conversations, Elena said. I always have. It's not useful in most contexts. In that context, she stopped. People talk to each other like I wasn't there. Men with money and plans and things to hide, and I was just... She turned the coffee cup. Nobody worth noticing. The quiet in the kitchen was the kind that happens when someone says something true that neither of them had said out loud before. I noticed, Gideon said. She looked up. The first time I came in for information about the Bridger dispute, he said. You remembered every conversation about it without being asked. I noticed. He picked up his coffee cup again. I just didn't know what I was looking at. Elena smiled at that. Not a big smile, not a performed one, just a small shift in her face that had nothing to do with making him feel better. Most people don't. The next morning, Gideon rode out to find the Pierce brothers. What he came back with was a box of documents, land filings, survey certificates, and 3 original deeds with Aldis's name on every one. He spread them across Elena's newly organized desk, and they sat across from each other for 2 hours going through them. Elena cross-referencing what was on paper against what she remembered hearing, Gideon writing notes in the cramped, slightly sideways handwriting that was apparently the result of being left-handed in a school that had tried to correct it. By the time the lamp needed oil, they had the outline of something that went well beyond a boundary dispute. "He's been doing this for years," Gideon said. He sat back and pressed his thumb between his eyebrows. "The surveys, the filings. It's not random error. It's systematic," Elena said. "Every mistake moves a boundary in Doss's favor, either incorporating adjacent land or establishing right-of-way that gives him water access he doesn't legally own." "There are at least 7 properties I can identify from what I heard," Elena said. 4 of those families have already moved away. They lost the disputes and couldn't afford to fight them." Gideon looked at the papers. "We need the original county records. What's on file in Millhaven?" "Yes." "Which means I need to go to Millhaven and I need someone to not remove anything from this desk while I'm gone." "I'll be here," Elena said. He looked up at her. "You're sure? It could take 2 days. And if Doss gets wind that I'm Gideon." She said his name the same way she had that first evening. Not sharp, just certain. "I've been sitting in a building owned by men with bad intentions for 6 years. I know how to wait." He rode out before dawn. Elena spent the first day going through the papers again. The second day she started on the garden, not because it needed doing, but because she needed to do something with her hands while she thought, and the weeds had been bothering her since she arrived. She was pulling the 4th row when she heard hoofbeats on the north road. Not Gideon. Too many horses for one man, and they were coming too fast. She stood up and looked. 3 riders coming from the east direction, the direction of Doss's range. She walked to the house. She set down the garden gloves. She went to the back pantry and pulled out the box she'd moved from the desk. The copies she'd made by hand of the most critical documents, written in her own careful handwriting, now in an oilskin wrap inside a flour sack under the 3rd shelf. She had done it the first night Gideon was gone, just in case. She went back to the kitchen and put water on to boil. When the knock came at the front door, she was standing at the stove with a dishcloth over her shoulder. She opened the door. Calder. He was one of Doss's men. She'd recognize his face in worse light than this. He had a square jaw and pale eyes, and the look of a man who had been told he was frightening often enough to believe it. He looked surprised to see her answer. He'd probably expected an empty house. "Deputy Hale isn't in," Elena said pleasantly, before he could speak. "I can see that," Calder said. "He'll be back tomorrow." She kept the door exactly wide enough to stand in. "Can I take a message?" Calder's eyes moved past her to the interior of the house. He was looking for something. She didn't know if he'd find it. The papers were still on the desk, because she hadn't wanted to make it obvious they'd been disturbed, and the copies were in the pantry, and either way she was the only one standing between him and whatever Doss had sent him to find. "Mr. Doss would like to speak with the deputy," Calder said. "I'll let him know." "At his earliest convenience." "Of course." Calder didn't move. He was still looking past her. "You know," he said, his voice dropping into a register that was probably meant to be intimidating, "this isn't a good situation for a woman on her own. House this far from town. Just the 2 of you out here." Elena looked at him steadily. She had perfected this look over 6 years. The absolute absence of any reaction that would give a man what he was hoping for. "Is there something else I can help you with?" Calder held the look for a moment. Then he stepped back. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She closed the door. She stood with her hand on the latch until she heard them ride away. Then she went back to the stove, poured the boiling water into the teapot, and stood at the window watching the road until she couldn't see them anymore. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady in a burning farmhouse, too, a long time ago. There was something about a specific kind of fear, the kind where you know exactly what you're afraid of and exactly how much time you have, that made her hands very, very steady. Gideon came back late the next afternoon with a saddlebag full of documents and tired eyes, and the look of a man who had slept twice in 2 days and eaten once. She told him about Calder over supper. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was his way of taking something seriously. "They know," he said when she finished. "They suspect," she said. "They don't know what you have." "Or what you have," he said, with a slight weight on the word that meant he'd already figured out she wouldn't have sat in that house for 2 days without making copies. "Or what I have," she agreed. He put down his fork. "Elena, if this goes the direction it's going, toward an actual filing, an actual legal challenge, Doss is going to come at this hard. He's been managing this county for years. He has people at the land office, probably at the circuit court. He's going to make this about you." "I know." "They're going to say you're a disgraced saloon woman who talked a young deputy into a scheme for personal gain." "I know." "They're going to be very specific about the kind of woman they believe you to be." Elena looked at him across the table. "Gideon," she said, "I know exactly what they're going to say about me, and I want you to understand something. I have been surviving what people say about me for a very long time. What I am not willing to survive is knowing what I know and doing nothing with it." She picked up her fork again. 7 families lost land they shouldn't have lost. 4 of them are already gone. The other 3 are still here. That's what this is about. Not me. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. He picked up his fork too. "Then we're going to need to be smarter than Doss, faster than his lawyers, and careful enough not to give him anything he can use to throw it out." "Good," Elena said. "I need you to write down everything you remember," he said. "Every conversation, every name, every date you can assign to it, as much detail as you can put down." "I've already started," she said. He looked at her. She didn't say anything else. After a moment, he shook his head slightly, not in disbelief exactly, more in the way of a man who keeps expecting to have reached the bottom of something and keeps finding there's more below. "How much do you have, Vic?" he asked. "Enough," Elena said, "to make Harlan Doss very uncomfortable." Outside, the wind had picked up along the ridge line, and the pine smell came down with it into the kitchen, and the lamp cast the room in the kind of golden light that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with work that needed doing. They pushed their plates aside and got to it. The written record Elena kept was not a diary. She was careful about that distinction from the start. A diary was personal, partial, the kind of document a lawyer could dismiss as the grievances of a bitter woman with an axe to grind. What she produced instead was something closer to a ledger. Date on the left where she could assign one. Name or names in the middle. What was said, as close to verbatim as her memory allowed, on the right. No editorial comment, no adjectives. Just the facts arranged in the order they happened, in the handwriting of a woman who had spent 6 years being invisible and had apparently used the time to become very precise. Gideon read the first 30 pages at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, and didn't say much. On the 3rd evening he looked up and said, "How are you this sure about the dates?" "Calder and Reeves always came in on Tuesday nights," Elena said from across the table where she was writing the next section. "The one about the Aldous survey was the Tuesday after the Pierce brothers filed their first grazing complaint. I remember because Reeves was annoyed about the complaint and said so, and then Calder told him Aldous had already fixed the filing and the complaint wouldn't go anywhere. I checked your records. The Pierce complaint is dated April 14th, so that conversation was April 15th. Gideon stared at her. "You built your own cross-reference." "It's the only way it holds up," she said. "Anybody can remember a conversation. Memory that connects to documents is different." He went back to reading. She went back to writing. The lamp burned low, and they didn't notice until the light went yellow and dim. And by then it was later than either of them had intended. This was how the weeks went. Not smoothly. Nothing in that house was smooth. Gideon had a temper that ran cold rather than hot, which meant when he was frustrated he went very quiet and very clipped, and Elena learned quickly that this was the version of him she needed to leave alone for 20 minutes, or the conversation became useless. She had her own version of the same thing, which was that she stopped talking entirely and cleaned something, and Gideon eventually figured out that Elena aggressively scrubbing a pot meant she was angry, not domestic. "You're washing that skillet like it owes you money," he said one evening. "It's fine," she said, in the tone that meant it was not fine. "What did I do?" She set the skillet down. You introduced me to Mrs. Alderman today as your, and I'm quoting, housekeeper. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. It was the easiest explanation. I understand that, Elena said, and I'm telling you I didn't like it, not asking you to fix it, just telling you. He was quiet for a moment. I should have said assistant. You should have said Elena Ashcroft, she said. But we can work up to that. She picked up the skillet again. The conversation was over. Gideon poured himself a second coffee, stood there for a moment looking at the floor, and then said, You're right. I'm sorry. She hadn't expected the apology. She turned around and looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. All right, she said. Next time, he said, I'll use your name. Good, she said. He did, the next time. It didn't stop the talk. Nothing was going to stop the talk. But she noticed he didn't flinch when he said it. That was something. The formal whisper campaign against Elena had been running since the second week. It had started, as these things usually did in Copperfield, with something small. A woman named Judith Carew told her friend that it was one thing for the deputy to be charitable to a woman in need, but quite another to let that woman run his household, and that in her experience, women from that kind of establishment didn't change their nature just because they changed their address. Her friend told two women at the milliner's. The women at the milliner's told their husbands. The husbands were the ones who eventually said it to Gideon's face, the way men did. Not as gossip, but as concern. There's people saying it reflects badly, said Tom Carew, Judith's husband, who ran the hardware store and considered himself a practical man. He said it to Gideon outside the post office on a Wednesday morning in a voice that was trying to be low but carried anyway. On your position, people expect a certain standard, Gideon said. That's right. And you feel that standard is relevant to whether I have a boarder in my spare room. A boarder, Tom Carew said carefully, is different from... Tom, Gideon said, I appreciate your concern. I'm going to continue to not discuss my domestic arrangements with you, and I'm going to ask that you extend me the same courtesy you'd extend any other deputy in this county. He tipped his hat. Give my regards to Judith. He told Elena about it that evening. He presented it as neutral information. This is what's being said. This is where it's coming from, without editorializing, which she appreciated. Judith Carew's husband, Elena said. Yes. Judith Carew buys gloves at the dry goods store every spring. She bought 3 pairs last March, paid for 2, and walked out while the clerk was dealing with a delivery. Elena paused. I don't hold that against her. I'm just saying the Carews have their own relationship with standards. Gideon's mouth did the thing it sometimes did. Not quite a smile, something more controlled than that. I'm not going to use that. I know, Elena said. I'm not suggesting you do. I'm just... She stopped, looked at her hands. Sometimes it helps to know that the people throwing stones have their own windows. Does it actually help? Or does it just feel like it should? She considered that. Mostly the second one, she admitted. He nodded once. They ate supper. What nobody in Copperfield knew, because nobody had thought to ask, and because Elena had never once brought it up in 6 years, was where she had come from before the Dusty Rose. She had appeared in Copperfield in the autumn of a year when the drought had pushed a lot of people in and out of the territory, and she had taken work at the only establishment that was hiring, and that was the whole of what anyone knew. People had filled in the rest themselves. They'd filled it in with the obvious. The obvious was usually easiest. And after enough time passed, the filling in became the truth. And the actual truth became irrelevant. The actual truth was this. She had grown up on a farm 50 miles north, the second daughter of a man named Hector Ashcroft, who grew wheat and made poor decisions and died of fever when Elena was 17, leaving the farm to debts and his daughters to themselves. Her older sister had married quickly and moved east. Elena had stayed for 2 years trying to hold the farm together, which she failed at, because she was 17 and then 19 and the land was mortgaged and the drought came. She had walked south with $40 and a good coat and her mother's recipe for preserved green tomatoes, which was not the most useful inheritance, but was what she had. She did not tell Gideon any of this, not because she was hiding it, She simply didn't know how to offer it without it sounding like an explanation. And she had been through enough in her life to know the difference between a story that needed telling and a story that was being told to generate sympathy. She wasn't interested in sympathy. She was interested in the land fraud. The land fraud was getting complicated. Gideon had filed a preliminary inquiry with the county land office in Mill Haven, carefully worded, citing the boundary discrepancies without naming Doss directly, asking for the original survey certifications for the 7 properties Elena had identified. It was a standard bureaucratic request, the kind that should have come back in 2 weeks. 6 weeks passed. "They're sitting on it," Gideon said. "Or someone told them to sit on it," Elena said. "Same thing." "Not legally," she said. "If someone instructed them to delay a legitimate inquiry, that's obstruction. If they're just slow, it's the land office being the land office." He looked at her. "When did you become a lawyer?" "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "I listen to lawyers. That's different, but it's not entirely different." He drafted a follow-up letter. Elena rewrote it. Not the substance, just the language, pulling it back from the slightly accusatory tone Gideon defaulted to when he was frustrated and recasting it as a polite but pointed inquiry that would be harder to ignore without creating a paper trail of its own. "You made it more polite," Gideon said, reading the revision. "I made it more dangerous," Elena said. "Polite documents that create paper trails are harder to bury than angry ones. Angry ones, someone files in the bottom drawer and nobody has to answer them. Polite ones, with specific dates and reference numbers, you have to respond to, or you've got a documented failure to respond." Gideon read it again. "Where do you learn these things?" "Same place as everything else," Elena said. "The bar on Tuesday nights." The second letter got a response in 9 days. Not the response they wanted. It was a request for additional documentation, but it was a response, which meant they were on record and the clock was running. It was around this time that Gideon started noticing the way Elena moved. He hadn't thought about it before, had no reason to. But once he noticed it, he couldn't stop noticing. The way she never raised her left arm above shoulder height. The way she put on her coat with a specific order and a specific care that wasn't vanity. The way she sat at the table with her left shoulder slightly angled away from whoever she was talking to. Not enough to seem rude, just enough to keep a certain angle from being visible. He had seen the scar once. It was an accident. She had been chopping wood at the north side of the house and had taken off her coat because the afternoon had warmed up and because she was working hard, and he came around the corner of the barn and caught a 2-second glimpse of the left side of her collar before she straightened and the collar shifted back into place. Not a knife wound. He'd seen knife wounds. This was wider, more irregular at the edges. Silver white, raised slightly, running from the hollow of her shoulder up across the collarbone. Burns. He didn't say anything. He went back around the barn and gave her 10 minutes before he came back by a different route and announced himself loudly enough that she'd have time to reset. When he came around the corner, she had her coat back on and was stacking wood like nothing had happened. He asked nothing. It wasn't his scar. But he thought about it. He thought about what kind of fire left a mark like that, and how it would have happened, and what it said about the woman who was sitting across his kitchen table building a legal case out of memory, in careful handwriting. Whatever had happened, she hadn't gotten that scar doing something small. The 3rd week of October, Harlan Doss made his first direct move. It came through Sheriff Calloway, which was how Doss usually moved, indirectly, through whatever structure was available, in a way that let him maintain distance from the result. Calloway called Gideon into the office on a Thursday morning, asked him to close the door, and then sat behind his desk with the expression of a man who was delivering news he was personally invested in being received calmly. "There's been a complaint," Calloway said. "About the land inquiry? About your living situation." Calloway set a piece of paper on the desk and pushed it toward Gideon without looking at him. "Formal complaint, filed with the county commissioner's office, states that a deputy sheriff maintaining an improper domestic arrangement with a woman of," and this is the language in the filing, "disreputable character is a conduct issue inconsistent with the position." Gideon picked up the paper and read it. His face did nothing in particular while he read it. This was one of the things Calloway found unsettling about him. He was hard to read when he was angry, which made it harder to manage him. "Who filed it?" Gideon asked. "That's filed as a community concern," Calloway said. "Anonymous." Anonymous community concerns don't usually arrive typed on county paper with proper filing references. Calloway said nothing. You know who filed this, Gideon said. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was a statement of a fact that both of them were aware of, and only one of them was going to acknowledge. My hands are tied, Gideon. It's a formal filing. I have to respond to it. What response are you planning? Calloway shifted in his chair. I'm planning to advise you to consider your options regarding your current domestic arrangement, informally, as your superior, before this escalates. And if I consider my options and decide they're fine as they are, then it goes to the commissioner formally. Gideon put the paper back on the desk. He straightened up. Tom Carew was in to see you yesterday afternoon, he said. I saw his horse out front. Calloway's jaw tightened slightly. Tom Carew has nothing to do with... Tom Carew is on the board of Doss's grazing cooperative, Gideon said. Which I know, because it's in a document I pulled from the county records in Millhaven 2 weeks ago. He's also on the list of names connected to 3 of the boundary filings that I currently have under inquiry. He picked up his hat. I'm noting for the record that you've received an anonymous complaint about my domestic situation at the same time that inquiry is pending. I'll let you draw whatever conclusions you like from that timing. He walked out. He was halfway down the street before he trusted himself to slow down. When he got home, Elena was at the table with the ledger open and a fresh page in front of her. She looked up when he came in and read his face. Not his expression, he didn't have much of one, but the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his silence. What happened? She said. He sat down and told her. All of it. The complaint, the language, the anonymous filing, Calloway's non-answers, Tom Carew's horse. He told it straight and flat, and when he was done, he picked up the coffee cup from in front of her because his was all the way across the room, and he didn't feel like getting up. Elena watched him drink her coffee. They're rattled, she said. I know. This is not the move of a man who thinks he's safe, she said. If Doss thought the inquiry was going nowhere, he'd let it go nowhere. Filing a complaint about your living arrangements means he's trying to discredit you before whatever we have becomes something he can't manage. Which means what we have is more dangerous than I thought. Or he thinks it is, she said, which is worth something too. Gideon set down the coffee cup. He's going to come after you specifically, he said. That filing is the first draft. Next version is going to be about you by name. I know. Elena. He waited until she looked at him. Is there anything about your past, anything at all, that he could use to make you look worse than they're already trying to make you look? She held his eyes. I've worked in a saloon for 6 years, she said. That's what there is. I'm not a murderer. I've never stolen anything. I've never done anything I'm ashamed of except possibly accept a position that required me to be pleasant to men I didn't respect. That's not something to be ashamed of. I know, she said, but they'll say it is. He was quiet. Then, there's something else. The scar... He stopped. You don't have to tell me. I'm not asking. But if there's a story attached to it that Doss could use, I'd rather know now. Elena was very still for a moment. There's a story attached to it, she said finally, and Harlan Doss cannot use it. How can you be sure? Because, she said, and her voice was entirely level, the people who know that story are the people whose children I pulled out of a burning building, and they don't know where I am. The kitchen went very quiet. Gideon looked at her. He waited, the way he always waited, without pushing, without filling the silence with something smaller than what she'd just said. I'm not going to tell you all of it tonight, Elena said. All right. But I will tell you that whatever they say about my character... She stopped, started again. That scar didn't come from a life I'm ashamed of. It came from the only minute of my life where I did something completely right without thinking about it, without calculating it. And I have never once regretted it. Gideon said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, Whose children? A family named Whitmore, Elena said. They had a farm about 40 miles north of here. Lightning struck the roof during a dry spell. The 2 youngest were inside. I was passing on the road. She looked at her hands. I got them out. I didn't get out quite fast enough myself. What happened to the Whitmores? They moved away the following spring, before anyone in the area had connected it to me specifically. I don't think they knew my name. She paused. I never went back to say I was the one who'd done it. There wasn't a point. They were safe. That was the point. You never told anyone. There was no one to tell, she said. I went south after that. $40 and a good coat. She looked up. That's how I ended up at the Dusty Rose. Gideon was very quiet for a long time. You could have used that, he said at last, any time in the last 6 years. You could have told that story, and people would have treated you differently. Maybe, Elena said, but it would have been using it, and it didn't feel like mine to use. She turned her coffee cup, and then remembered she'd given it to him and reached across the table and took it back. I didn't do it so people would treat me better. I did it because 2 children were in a burning building. Gideon let her take the cup. He sat with his hands flat on the table. Outside the window, the last of the evening light was going off the ridge, and the temperature was dropping the way it did in late October, sharply, like a door closing. Elena got up to put more wood on the fire. She moved the way she always moved. Right arm first, left side angled slightly, the coat she hadn't taken off still across her shoulders. I'm going to write to the circuit court directly, Gideon said. Not through Millhaven, directly to the presiding judge. We have enough in documentation now to request a formal review of the Aldous surveys. That's a significant escalation. So is filing a formal complaint to discredit us before we can get there, he said. We escalate, or we let him bury it. Elena came back to the table. Then write the letter, she said. I'll check it over before you send it. I know you will, he said, without any edge, just acknowledgement. She sat down and opened the ledger again. He pulled his paper toward him and found a pen. For a while, the only sounds in the house were the scratch of 2 people writing and the fire settling and the wind off the ridge finding the gap under the kitchen door that neither of them had fixed yet. At some point, Elena looked up and said, The window in the spare room is sticking again. Put your shoulder into it, Gideon said, without looking up from the letter. I know, she said. I just thought you should know it still needs fixing. I'll fix it on Saturday. You said that last Saturday. I mean it more this Saturday. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been skepticism. It was genuinely difficult to tell with Elena, and went back to the ledger. Gideon went back to his letter. The fire burned down, and neither of them noticed until it was late enough that the sensible thing was to bank it for the night and go to bed, which was what they did. There was nothing romantic about it. There was nothing smooth about any of it. There was just the work and the house and the ridge and the growing stack of papers that represented the evidence of something that had been done to people who couldn't defend themselves, and 2 imperfect people trying to build it into something that could stand up in a court. That was all. That was enough. 3 days later, Calder came back. This time without the other riders, and this time he didn't knock. He walked into the front yard while Gideon was repairing the fence and stopped at the gate with his hands loose at his sides. Mr. Doss would like to offer a resolution, Calder said. Gideon kept working. He didn't look up. I'm listening. The inquiry gets dropped. Mr. Doss acknowledges a minor survey discrepancy on the Bridger parcel, adjusts the boundary line by the necessary footage, and considers the matter closed. The Pierce brothers get their strip back. Calder paused. And the complaint against your position gets withdrawn. Gideon set down the fence tool. He straightened up slowly. He looked at Calder. 1 parcel, he said. The Bridger parcel. Yes. Not the 6 others. Calder's face gave nothing away. I'm not aware of any others. That's interesting, Gideon said, because I am. Calder looked at him steadily. This is a generous offer, Deputy. It solves your problem and avoids a process that could get complicated for everyone. Complicated for Mr. Doss, you mean? Complicated, Calder repeated, for everyone. Gideon picked up the fence tool again. Tell Mr. Doss I'll consider it, he said. Calder rode away. Elena had watched the whole thing from the kitchen window. When Gideon came inside, she had tea on the table and her expression was unreadable in the specific way it went when she was doing math in her head. He only offered 1 parcel, she said. Yes. Which means he knows about the others, but he's hoping we only have documentation on the Bridger one. That's what I think too. Or he's testing what we'll take. Also possible. She looked at him. Are you going to take it? Gideon sat down. He wrapped both hands around the mug. No, he said. 6 families, Elena. I'm not trading 6 families for an easy resolution and my job back. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded once, the small, complete nod that meant she'd already known what he was going to say and was merely confirming it. Then we keep going, she said. We keep going, he said. Outside, the October wind pushed against the north wall of the house, and somewhere down the road a door banged, and the ridge held its color against the gray sky the way it always did, indifferent to all the human arrangements playing out below it. The letter to the circuit court went out on a Friday. Gideon wrote it to Millhaven himself rather than trust it to the postal route, which ran through a relay station on the eastern edge of Doss's range, and had, Elena pointed out, at least 2 handlers whose names appeared in her ledger in connection with Doss's operation. Gideon hadn't argued. He was learning when not to argue with Elena, which was most of the time, and the occasions when he did argue were becoming more tactical and less reflexive. He was gone 2 days. Elena spent the time the way she spent all his absences, working, reading the survey documents again, looking for things she'd missed, and checking the road more often than she would have admitted to anyone. He came back on Sunday evening with a receipt of filing and mud on his boots and the particular expression of a man who had sat in a saddle for longer than was comfortable and was not going to say so. They accepted it, he said, dropping into the kitchen chair. Of course they accepted it, Elena said. You filed it correctly. That's not always enough. No, she agreed, but it's a start. She put a plate in front of him. He ate without ceremony, the way he ate everything. Efficiently, without much attention to the food itself, as though eating were an obligation rather than a pleasure. She had noticed this about him early on and had stopped trying to cook things that required appreciation. Beans were fine. Salt pork was fine. The preserved green tomatoes he'd eaten straight from the jar the first time she'd left them on the table, without comment, which she'd taken as approval. The clerk at the circuit court was nervous, Gideon said between bites. Nervous how? The way people are nervous when they know who a filing is pointed at and they're not sure which side is safer to be on. He pushed the plate back slightly. He took it. He logged it. He gave me the receipt, but he asked twice whether I'd discussed the filing with Sheriff Calloway. Twice, Elena said. Both times I said it was a matter under active inquiry and referred him to the formal record. Good. He's going to tell someone, Gideon said. I don't know who he talks to up there, but a man that nervous talks to somebody. Then we have maybe 2 weeks before Doss knows exactly what we filed and with whom, Elena said. She sat down across from him. What does the circuit court do with it from here? Assigns a reviewing judge. If the judge finds sufficient cause, he orders a full audit of the named surveys. He rubbed the back of his neck. Could take a month. Could take 3. And in the meantime, Doss has a complaint pending against my position. The land office in Millhaven has been sitting on our documentation request for 2 months, and Calloway is going to be receiving pressure from at least 3 directions to do something about me. Elena was quiet for a moment. The Pierce brothers, she said. Have you spoken to them recently? 2 weeks ago. They need to file a formal statement, their own account of the boundary issue and when they first noticed the cattle grazing. If it's in their words attached to a separate filing, then even if something happens to our inquiry, there's another record. Gideon looked at her. What do you mean, if something happens to our inquiry? I mean, if it gets lost, Elena said, or misfiled, or if the reviewing judge turns out to know Harlan Doss from his club in the Capitol. She held his eyes. I mean, we should have copies of everything in more than one place. And we should have other people's names on record besides ours. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You don't trust the system, he said. I trust the system when it has enough witnesses that it's embarrassed not to work, Elena said. I'm less confident when it's just us. He nodded slowly. I'll ride out to the Pierce place tomorrow. Take the copies from the pantry, she said. Let them see what we have. Men fight harder when they know someone else is already fighting. He looked at her. You've thought about this for a while. I've thought about everything for a while, she said. I don't sleep that well. It was the most personal thing she'd said in weeks. She said it without apparent intention, the way people let something slip when they're tired and their guard has been doing heavy work for too long. Gideon didn't make a thing of it. He just said, "The window's still sticking." And she said, "I know, you said Saturday." And he said, "I was in Millhaven on Saturday." And she said, "You were in Millhaven on Saturday and Sunday." And he said, "Fair point." And that was the end of it. He fixed the window the following Saturday. It still stuck a little, but it opened without requiring her shoulder, and she didn't tell him that was good enough because she didn't want to give him the satisfaction, and also because she genuinely wasn't sure it was. November came in gray and cold, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself but simply settled into the walls of things and stayed. The ridge went brown except for the pines, which stayed dark against the sky and made the house feel at once more exposed and better anchored, depending on the light. The Pierce brothers filed their statement the second week of November. Walt and Daniel Pierce were not sophisticated men. Walt ran cattle and Daniel fixed equipment, and they had come to the frontier from Ohio 15 years ago with a plan that had mostly worked until Doss's cattle started appearing on their eastern pasture. But they were honest, and their statement was honest, and it was witnessed by the Methodist minister in Copperfield, which added a layer of procedural credibility that Gideon said was useful. Elena spent an afternoon with Walt Pierce going through the timeline, asking him to be specific about dates and descriptions, helping him understand that vagueness was the enemy of a legal claim. Walt was a patient man who looked at her with the faintly puzzled expression of someone who had not expected to receive practical legal guidance from a woman in a kitchen, but he listened and he asked intelligent questions and he went away with a clearer statement than he'd arrived with. "You're good at that," Gideon said, after Walt had ridden out. "At what?" "Getting people to say clearly what they actually mean without making them feel stupid." Elena wiped the table where Walt had spread his papers. "He's not stupid," she said. "He just doesn't know the right vocabulary. Most people don't." She folded the cloth. "When I was working at the Dusty Rose, men would talk around things for an hour before they said what they meant. You learn to hear the shape of what's coming before they find the words for it. That's a strange skill to come out of that work." "Most skills come from strange places," she said. He didn't answer that. He was looking at the door where Walt had gone, and he had the distant expression that meant he was chewing on something. "What?" Elena said. "Nothing. You have a look." "I don't have looks," Gideon said. "You have a specific one that means you're thinking about something you're not sure you want to say yet." She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Go ahead and say it." He looked at her for a moment. "I was thinking that you've been here 3 months," he said, "and I've been trying to figure out what to do about that for you, going forward, after this." Elena was very still. "After this," she said, "when the inquiry is resolved, one way or another." He looked at the table. "I don't know what you want to do, where you want to go. I've been assuming you have a plan and haven't told me, but lately I'm not sure you do." She didn't say anything immediately. She turned the cloth in her hands. "I don't have a plan," she said finally. "I haven't had a plan since the Dusty Rose closed. I've been doing this." She indicated the table, the papers, the work. "This is what I've been doing." "I know," he said. "I'm asking what comes after." "I don't know," she said. And then, because she was Elena Ashcroft and she didn't leave things imprecise when she could be precise, "I know what I don't want. I don't want to go to Millhaven and take a position at another establishment and start this whole... I don't want that." She set down the cloth. "Beyond that, I haven't gotten far." Gideon nodded. He still wasn't looking at her directly. "You could stay," he said, "in the capacity you're already in, if you wanted to." "As your housekeeper," she said, dry but not unkind. "As my assistant," he said, "and whatever else you want to call it." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in the offer that was more careful than it sounded. The words were plain, but the care underneath them was not. She was 31 years old, and she had been alone for a long time, not miserably alone, but fundamentally alone, and she had trained herself out of wanting things that cost too much, because wanting things that cost too much was how you ended up on a porch with the door closed in your face. "Let me think about it," she said. "All right," he said. And that was all. He didn't press and she didn't decide, and they went back to the work because the work was there, and needed doing, and it was easier than most of what was underneath it. Then December arrived, and Harlan Doss stopped being patient. It started with the Pierce brothers. Specifically, it started on a Tuesday morning when Daniel Pierce rode into town with a cut above his eye and a story about 3 men who had come onto the eastern pasture the previous evening while he was checking the fence line. They hadn't said anything explicitly threatening. They'd just watched him, sat their horses and watched him, and then rode back the direction they'd come. One of them, Daniel said, was a man he'd seen working Doss's southern range. Gideon filed an incident report. He rode out to the Pierce property. He talked to Walt and Daniel for an hour and came back with a tight jaw and a very short way of talking. "He's escalating," Elena said. "He's warning them off," Gideon said. "The filing spooked him, and now he's warning them." "If Walt and Daniel withdraw their statement, they won't," Gideon said. "Walt told me to my face he'd sooner sell the whole place and eat the loss than let Doss scare him into dropping it. He said that. He also said some other things that I won't repeat, but the overall message was clear." Gideon pulled off his hat and set it on the table. "But I can't guarantee their safety if this keeps going. I'm one deputy. Calloway is—" He stopped. "Calloway is what?" Elena said. "Calloway is not going to allocate resources to protect 2 farmers who are part of a land fraud case he'd rather didn't exist." Elena was quiet. She had pulled the ledger toward her, a reflex by now, reaching for it when something needed thinking through. "The men who came onto the Pierce land," she said. "Did Daniel describe them?" "One tall, one medium, one with a red beard." "Red beard," Elena said. Gideon looked at her. "You know him." "A man named Fitch," she said. She was already turning pages. "He came in twice in the spring of the year before last. Worked for Doss seasonally. He and Reeves had a conversation about—" "Here." She found the page. March 18th, Reeves told Fitch the arrangement required that nobody left marks. That's the word he used. Marks. She looked up. "At the time I thought they meant cattle brands. Now I'm not sure." "You think they meant physical marks on people?" "I think it's possible," Elena said, "which means this isn't the first time Doss has used men to frighten people who were causing problems." Gideon sat down slowly. He took the ledger when she slid it toward him and read the entry. His face was still, but his hands were pressing slightly harder against the edges of the book than usual. "If I can connect Fitch to the Pierce incident and to this entry," he said. "It's not direct," Elena said. "It's suggestive. It puts Doss in the pattern of using intimidation alongside the fraud, which is useful context for the circuit court. But a judge is going to want more than a saloon conversation from 4 years ago." "I know." He slid the ledger back. "I need Fitch's whereabouts documented, someone who can place him on the Pierce property that evening. Walt can identify him if you can show him a way to make the identification official. That means getting a description sworn before a notary, which means Millhaven." He rubbed his face. "I'm spending half my life riding to Millhaven. The Pierce brothers can make the ride. Not alone right now." "Then go with them," Elena said. "I'll be here." He looked at her. "Calder was here last week," he said. "Not accusing, just stating." "Calder was at the gate," Elena said. "He didn't come in. And if he'd tried to come in, I'd have—" She stopped. "I'm not helpless, Gideon." "I know you're not helpless," he said. "I just don't like leaving you here alone when Doss is moving pieces." It was the first time he'd said directly that he didn't want to leave her, framed as he'd framed it, which was as concern for her safety, but also as something else that neither of them was going to name across a kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. "I'll be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "I still don't like it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Go to Millhaven. Get the identification sworn. Come back." He went. He came back. Walt Pierce swore a description that matched Fitch and placed him on the property. The sworn statement went into the file alongside everything else. What came next was quieter and more damaging than anything Doss had done with riders on pastures. It came through the newspaper. Copperfield had a weekly paper, 4 pages, printed on Thursdays, mostly given to land sale notices and livestock prices and occasional editorials from the editor, a man named Horace Pitts, who had very fixed views about frontier morality and very flexible standards about fact-checking. On the second Thursday of December, the front page of the Copperfield Weekly carried a piece about conduct standards for county law enforcement, which did not name Gideon directly, but described in substantial detail a young deputy whose judgment had been called into question by his association with a woman of disreputable history who had previously been employed in a now-closed establishment and whose background prior to her arrival in Copperfield was entirely unverified. Elena read it at the kitchen table the morning it came out. Gideon read it standing by the door, still in his coat. When he finished, he put it down on the table without crumpling it, which took some visible effort. "Pitts," he said. "Pitts wrote it," Elena said. "Doss handed it to him." "I know." "Unverified background," Elena said. She ran her finger along the line. "That's the specific language. It's chosen carefully. It's not an accusation. It just creates an implication that there's something to hide." "Is there?" Gideon said. Not suspiciously, genuinely. "You know my background," Elena said. "I told you." "I know what you told me," he said. "Is there anything else?" She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "All right," he said. "You believe me?" "Yes," he said simply, as though it wasn't complicated, even though they both knew it was somewhat complicated given the circumstances. He picked up his hat. "I'm going to speak to Pitts." "What are you going to say?" "I'm going to ask him who gave him the piece," Gideon said. "He won't tell you." "I know," Gideon said, "but I'll know from how he doesn't tell me." He was right about that. He came back 2 hours later and said that Pitts had received a written statement from a source he declined to name, and that the written statement had arrived in an envelope with County Commissioner's Office letterhead, which Pitts had shown him the edge of by accident while trying to hide it, and that Pitts was considerably more nervous than a man writing a community interest piece had any reason to be. "Commissioner's letterhead," Elena said. "Which could mean the commissioner," Gideon said. "Or it could mean someone with access to commissioner's letterhead." "Tom Carew," Elena said. "Tom Carew is on the County Commerce Board," Gideon said, "which meets in the commissioner's building." Elena sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the ledger to a clean page and wrote Tom Carew at the top. "Don't put anything in there you're not sure of," Gideon said. "I'm noting the connection," Elena said. "Not drawing the conclusion. That's your job." He said nothing. She wrote. 3 days later, the traveling couple arrived. It was a Saturday, overcast and cold enough that Elena had kept the fire burning through the morning. She heard wheels on the north road and looked up from the window and saw a wagon she didn't recognize. Good horses, not new but well kept, with a family on the seat. A man, a woman, and in the bed of the wagon, wrapped in blankets, 3 children of various sizes. They stopped at Gideon's gate. The man got down. Elena watched him come to the door, and she noticed he was looking at the house number and then at a piece of paper in his hand, the way people look when they're checking an address. She went to the door before he knocked. He was perhaps 50, solid built, with the sun-weathered face of a man who had spent decades working outside. He looked at her and stopped. Not the way men usually stopped when they looked at her. Not assessment, not the particular sliding look she'd gotten used to over 6 years. Something different. Something searching. "I'm looking for a woman named Elena," he said. "We were told she might be here. We don't have a last name. We just know Elena." Elena's hand tightened on the doorframe, just slightly. "Who told you?" she said. "A man in Millhaven," the man said. We've been asking around for a while, years actually. We had a description and a first name, and we followed it west, but..." He stopped. He was still looking at her with that particular searching quality. "Forgive me. My name is August Whitmore. This is my wife, Clara." The woman had come down from the wagon. She was standing at the gate with her hands folded in front of her, watching Elena with an expression that Elena could not immediately read. The name landed in Elena's chest like a stone into still water. Whitmore. August Whitmore. She said nothing for a moment. She kept her face exactly where it was, which required some effort. "What can I do for you, Mr. Whitmore?" she said. "We're looking for the woman who saved our children," he said. 8 years ago. There was a fire." He stopped again. His voice had changed registers slightly. "Our farm, lightning strike. We were in town when it happened. Two of our children were inside. He looked at her directly. A woman pulled them out. We never knew her name. We didn't even see her face properly. There was so much smoke, but our daughter described her. The way she moved, He stopped. Clara Whitmore had walked through the gate. She was closer now, and her eyes were not searching anymore. They were certain. Your shoulder, Clara said softly. May I? Elena looked at her. Our daughter described it, Clara said. The scar. She was 7 years old, and she remembered everything about the woman who carried her out of that building. Her voice was very steady, but her hands were not. She said the woman had a silver mark on her shoulder that she'd seen when the woman's collar shifted. She described the shape of it. Elena stood in the doorway. She was not going to cry. That was not something she did, had not done in a very long time, but something was happening behind her sternum that was not exactly pain and not exactly relief, and was possibly both at the same time, pressed up against each other in the particular way of things that have been held too long in too small a space. She reached up and moved her collar. Clara Whitmore put both hands over her mouth. August Whitmore looked at the silver scar running across Elena's collarbone and said nothing for a moment that went on long enough to have weather in it. It's you, he said. Yes, Elena said. He was a solid, practical man who had probably not cried in front of strangers since he was a boy, and he was very close to it now. We've been looking for 8 years, he said. We went back the next spring to find you, and you were gone. Nobody in the area knew your name. We followed every lead we could. I went south, Elena said. Her voice was steady, mostly. I needed work. You needed a doctor, Clara said, and her voice broke slightly on the last word. I found one eventually, Elena said. I was all right. You were not all right, Clara said. You were... She stopped. She looked at the scar again. You walked out of a burning building carrying my daughter, and you didn't even tell anyone your name. There wasn't a point, Elena said. They were safe. That was the point. August Whitmore made a sound that was not quite a word. He pressed his hand briefly to his forehead, the way men do when they are trying to collect themselves, and not quite managing it. We've told this story for 8 years, he said, to everyone we met. We wanted... He stopped again. We wanted to find you. We wanted you to know that Margaret, our eldest, the one who remembered the scar. She talks about the woman who saved her. As long as she's lived, she's talked about her. His voice was rough now, not hiding it anymore. She's 15 years old and she still says, I want to find her. I want to tell her she mattered. Elena held the door frame with one hand. She was aware, distantly, that she was gripping it harder than necessary. It mattered, August said. You mattered. Whatever your life has been since, whatever anyone has told you about yourself, I want you to know that. Elena did not say anything for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and said, Come in. I'll put water on. They came in. All 5 of them, August and Clara and the 3 children, 2 boys and the girl in the middle, who was 11 and had her mother's eyes, and who looked at Elena from under her blanket with the frank, direct gaze of a child who was trying to match a person to a story she'd been carrying for years. Elena put water on. She got cups down from the shelf. She moved around the kitchen with the same efficiency she brought to everything, but her hands were not entirely steady, and she did not try to pretend they were. Gideon came home 40 minutes later. He walked into a kitchen containing 5 strangers, Elena at the stove, and an atmosphere that he read immediately as significant without knowing the content of it. He stopped in the doorway. Elena turned and looked at him. Gideon, she said. This is the Whitmore family. She turned the cup in her hands. August, Clara. This is Gideon Hale. He's... She paused, just briefly, the length of a breath. He's the reason I'm still in Copperfield. August Whitmore stood up and extended his hand. Your deputy, he said. His deputy, Elena said. Gideon shook the hand. He looked at Elena across the kitchen with a question in his face that he was not going to ask in front of company, and she gave him the small nod that meant, later. I'll explain later. He accepted this and sat down and was, as he generally was when he didn't have enough information yet, very quiet and very attentive. The Whitmores stayed for 2 hours. They told their story, the fire, The terror of arriving home to smoke, and the neighbors gathered and 2 children alive who should have been dead, the fruitless search for the woman who'd pulled them out, the years of asking. Clara pulled out a small journal in which she had written, years ago, what each child remembered, the way the woman moved, the color of her hair, the silver mark on her shoulder. When they finally stood to go, August Whitmore shook Elena's hand and held it for a moment. "We're staying in Copperfield for a few days," he said. "We had other business, but if you're willing, we'd like to see you again." "Yes," Elena said. "And," he said more slowly, "if you'd permit it, we'd like people to know what you did, what you've been carrying." He looked at her steadily. "It doesn't seem right that you've been here all this time and nobody knew." Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about Judith Carew and Mrs. Hennessy and the Copperfield Weekly and Harlan Doss's patient, systematic campaign to make her into exactly what it was convenient for her to be. "Let me think about it," she said. August Whitmore nodded. He didn't press. He walked his family back to the wagon. The youngest boy looked back at Elena from the gate with the open, unguarded curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. She raised one hand. He waved back. They drove away. Gideon closed the door. He turned around. Elena was standing in the middle of the kitchen with her back to him, both hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. "Elena," he said. "Give me a minute," she said. He gave her a minute. He gave her 2. He went to the stove and poured what was left of the water into a cup and set it in front of her and sat down across the table without saying anything. After a while, she sat down too. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "That was the Whitmore family," she said. "I understood that much," Gideon said. "The children," she said. "From the fire." She stopped. Started again. "I didn't think I'd ever—" She stopped again. "Take your time," Gideon said. She looked at her hands. Then she looked up at him. "August Whitmore wants to tell people," she said, "about the fire. About me." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" "I don't know," she said. "A week ago I would have said it doesn't matter, that it's not the point." She turned the cup. "Now they're here and they've been looking for 8 years, and that girl—" Her voice shifted slightly on the last word, controlled itself. "She's been telling that story for 8 years, about a woman she doesn't know." "You're the woman," Gideon said. "You've always been the woman." "I know," Elena said. "It's different when someone else knows it too." He said nothing. Outside, the wind had picked up along the ridge, and the light through the kitchen window had the thin, precise quality of December afternoon, and somewhere down the north road the Whitmore wagon was rolling back toward town. Elena straightened. She pulled the ledger toward her. She opened it to the page with Tom Carew's name at the top. "Doss published that piece to make me look like I had something to hide," she said. "And he's going to do more. He's going to make this about my background because he can't make it about the fraud directly." "Yes," Gideon said. "If August Whitmore tells his story," Elena said, "then Doss has nothing to work with. The woman with the unverified background becomes the woman who pulled 2 children out of a fire and never asked for recognition." Gideon looked at her carefully. "Is that why you'd do it? As a strategic move against Doss?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, without the comfort of a quick answer. "No," she said. "I'd do it because that girl is 15 years old, and she's been telling the story for 8 years, and she deserves to know it ends somewhere." She paused. "The Doss piece is a reason it matters now, instead of later." Gideon nodded slowly. "When Whitmore tells that story publicly," he said, "Copperfield is going to have to reckon with what it's done to you." "I know," Elena said. "I'm not doing it for that either." "I know you're not," he said. "I'm just saying it's going to happen anyway." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was on now, the December light having given up what little warmth it had. The ledger was open between them, Tom Carew's name at the top of a fresh page, and outside the ridge held its dark line against the sky, and the pines were black and still. "All right," she said, "then let it happen. August." Whitmore told his story on a Monday morning. He hadn't planned the timing particularly. He'd simply gone into Copperfield to buy supplies before moving on, and run into Walt Pierce outside the feed store, and Walt had asked about his wagon and his family, and August had answered, the way a man answers when he's been carrying something for 8 years and someone finally asks the right adjacent question. Within 20 minutes, there were 4 men standing in the cold outside the feed store, listening to August Whitmore describe a fire, a woman, a scar, and 8 years of searching. By noon, it had reached the dry goods store. By 2 in the afternoon, it had reached the sheriff's office, which was how Calloway heard it, from Tom Carew's wife Judith, who had heard it from the milliner, who had heard it from a woman whose husband had been at the feed store. Elena heard it the way she heard most things about herself. Secondhand, filtered, arriving at Gideon's kitchen table in the form of Gideon himself, who came home earlier than expected and set his hat on the table and said, "People are talking." "About the Whitmores," Elena said. She didn't look up from the ledger immediately. "Yes." "How bad is it?" He sat down. "It's not bad," he said carefully. "It's the opposite of bad, actually, which is its own kind of complicated." She looked up then. "Walt Pierce told me he heard the story, and then he went directly into the hardware store and told Tom Carew that he thought Copperfield ought to be ashamed of itself," Gideon said. "In those words. In front of 2 other customers." Elena was quiet for a moment. "What did Tom Carew say?" "According to Walt, Tom said he didn't know anything about any fire, and Walt said that was exactly the problem. That people in this town made judgments about people they didn't know anything about." Gideon picked up his hat and set it down again, the fidgeting he did when he was working through something. "There are people who feel bad, Elena. Genuinely. Mrs. Alderman came to the office this afternoon and asked me whether you were all right and whether there was anything she could do." "Mrs. Alderman crossed the street to avoid me in October," Elena said. "I know. She crossed to the other side very deliberately. She held her skirt up so it wouldn't brush against me." "I know," Gideon said. Elena looked at the table. She was not angry, exactly. She was something more complicated than angry, something that had the shape of anger but was made of older material. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were fine." "That's more generous than I might have been," Elena said. "Probably," Gideon said. "She meant well today." "She didn't mean well in October." "No," he said. "She didn't." He looked at her directly. "Nobody's going to force you to receive apologies you don't want. That's not what I'm telling you. I'm just telling you the temperature has changed." She sat with that for a moment. The temperature had changed. 6 weeks ago, the Copperfield Weekly had run a piece implying she was a woman with something to hide. Today, Mrs. Alderman wanted to know if she was all right. The distance between those 2 points was not made of any change in Elena herself. She was the same woman in the same kitchen. The only thing that had changed was what people knew. That was what bothered her, not the apologies. She could take apologies or leave them. What bothered her was that it had taken a family arriving from out of state to make people see what had been in front of them the whole time. She had not changed. They had. And the reason they'd changed was not any failing on her part, but the specific way human beings arrange their understanding of other human beings. By category first, by fact later, if ever. She didn't say any of this to Gideon. He would have agreed. An agreement from Gideon when she was working through something difficult had a tendency to short-circuit the working through. "Is Doss doing anything?" she asked instead. "Not visibly," Gideon said. "But Calder was seen outside the county commissioner's building this morning, early." "He's recalibrating," Elena said. "That's what I think." "The complaint against you, the conduct filing, still pending," Gideon said. "But I have a feeling it's about to become more complicated to pursue." He was right about that. The following morning, August Whitmore went to Sheriff Calloway's office and asked to make a formal statement about the events of 8 years prior, the fire, the children, the woman, the scar, and asked that the statement be entered into the public record of Copperfield County. Calloway, who was a man who could read which direction weather was moving, accepted the statement and had it witnessed and filed it before noon. Elena didn't know about this until Gideon came home with a copy. She read it at the kitchen table. August's account was plain and direct. The kind of writing that comes from a man who has told a story so many times he has found the essential shape of it and stripped away everything else. The fire, the smoke, coming home to a scene that should have been a catastrophe, and finding his children alive because of a woman nobody knew. The 8-year search. The silver scar on her left shoulder. When she finished reading, she folded the paper once and set it on the table. He asked Calloway to enter it publicly, she said. Yes. He didn't tell me he was going to do that. No, Gideon said. He came to see you this afternoon while you were in the garden. I told him you were occupied. She looked up sharply. You told him I was occupied. You were pulling fence posts, Gideon said. You had that look. What look? The one that means you need to do something physical with your hands, and nobody should interrupt you for at least an hour. He held up one hand. I told him to come back tomorrow. He said that was fine, and he'd bring his daughter. Elena stared at him. He's bringing Margaret. He said she asked specifically. Gideon looked at her steadily. You don't have to see them if you don't want to. I can send word. I want to, Elena said, more quickly than she'd intended. She stopped. I want to, she said again, more evenly. It's a great deal of things happening very quickly. Yes, Gideon said. It is. She picked up the folded paper and put it in the ledger. Not filed exactly, just placed. She wasn't sure yet what to do with a document that was about her and not by her, that existed in the official record of a county she'd been living in for 6 years without anyone thinking to ask about her history. The circuit court sent a preliminary response, Gideon said. He had been waiting to tell her this, she realized. She could tell by the way he said it, which was slightly too casual for a man delivering ordinary news. I got it this morning before the Whitmore business. She went still. And? A reviewing judge has been assigned, Gideon said. Judge Harland Ames, out of the Capitol. He's requesting the full survey documentation for all 7 properties and a written account of the inquiry process. He paused. He specifically requested supporting witness accounts. The ledger, Elena said. Your written record? Yes, Gideon said. He's not calling it testimony yet. He's calling it supplementary documentation. But Elena, he leaned forward slightly. Ames is clean. I asked 2 people who would know. He doesn't owe Doss anything, and he doesn't owe the Millhaven Land Office anything. He's been on the circuit bench for 12 years, and nobody has a story on him. People always have stories on people eventually, Elena said. Sometimes they don't, Gideon said. She turned the ledger on the table. 240 pages of dates and names and careful, specific language. She had written the last 40 pages over the past 3 weeks, filling in earlier gaps as additional memories surfaced. The way they did. Not in order, but in clusters. One conversation triggering the memory of another that had happened 6 months before or 2 years later. If Ames requests my account formally, she said, I'll need to swear to it. Yes, Gideon said. In court. Possibly. Or in a deposition before a court officer, but yes, under oath. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment she started writing the ledger. That the end point of a careful written record was always a room with a judge, and a question, and a right hand raised. She had known it, and had not thought about it too specifically, because thinking about it too specifically had a way of making the work feel different, and she needed the work to feel like the work, not like the prelude to something terrifying. I need more coffee, she said. Gideon got up and got it. He poured one for himself too and sat back down. Outside, the December wind was finding its way under the kitchen door again, the gap that neither of them had gotten around to fixing. Elena had stuffed a rag into it 2 weeks ago, which had helped somewhat. Tell me about Ames, she said. Tell me everything you know. He told her. He'd asked around carefully. A circuit court clerk he'd met during one of the Millhaven trips, a lawyer named Greer who'd practiced before Ames twice, a land office employee who was not connected to the problematic land office, but the one 2 counties west. The picture that assembled was of a judge in his 60s, methodical, with a known preference for documentary evidence over testimony alone, and a professional irritation with fraud cases that had been allowed to compound over time because nobody had caught them early. He has a thing about surveyors specifically, Gideon said. The clerk mentioned it. Ames took a case 5 years ago where a surveyor had been falsifying boundary measurements systematically across 4 counties. He called it, quote, a particular species of dishonesty because it exploits the public's reasonable trust in official documentation. Elena looked at the table. Aldous, she said. Yes. J.W. Aldous and his work for Harlan Doss is exactly the kind of case Ames considers a particular species of dishonesty. That's what I thought too, Gideon said. She picked up her coffee cup. She was doing the math in her head. The documentation they had, the witness accounts they'd gathered, the ledger, the sworn statements from Walt and Daniel Pierce, the timeline Elena had constructed connecting Aldous' survey filings to the 7 properties and the dates the families had either sold under pressure or lost disputes they shouldn't have lost. It's enough, she said. If he looks at it honestly, it's enough. I think so too, Gideon said. You think or you know? I think, he said. I won't know until he's seen it. She appreciated that he didn't promise her anything. She had been promised things before by men who meant well and were wrong, and the careful acknowledgement of uncertainty was, at this point in her life, a quality she found more reassuring than confidence. Margaret Whitmore was 15 years old and had her father's practical quality in a version that hadn't yet been tempered by the specific kind of disappointment that comes from decades of negotiating with the world. She arrived the next morning with August, walked through Gideon's front gate, and looked at Elena with the direct, slightly unnerving gaze of a girl who had been holding a specific face in her mind for 8 years and was now cross-referencing it against the original. I remember your hair, Margaret said by way of greeting. It was loose when you came through the window. The door was blocked, Elena said. I had to come in through the kitchen window. I know, Margaret said. You broke the glass with your elbow. I remember the sound. She stopped. She had been matter-of-fact up to this point in the way of a girl who had rehearsed this encounter many times without quite being able to account for how it would actually feel. Something shifted in her face. I was 4 years old, she said. Henry was 6. We'd been told to stay in the house. You were staying, Elena said. You were doing what you were supposed to do. The house was the problem, not you. Margaret looked at her for a moment. My mother said you carried Henry first because he was closest to the window and the ceiling was already going. Yes. And then you went back for me. Yes. That's what I can't... Margaret stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly, the gesture of someone who has made a decision about composure and is enforcing it. You went back. After the first trip, you didn't have to. No, Elena said. I didn't. She said it simply, without drama, and Margaret looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone filing something carefully away in a place where it would be kept. I told everyone, Margaret said, at school, at my aunt's house, everywhere we went looking. I always said there was a woman and she went back. That was the part I told. She met Elena's eyes. I wanted to find you because I wanted you to know that somebody remembered that you went back. Elena was quiet for a moment. I know, she said finally, and I'm glad you told me. They went inside. August had coffee. Margaret sat across from Elena and asked questions with the focused curiosity of a girl who had been waiting a long time to have them answered. What Elena's name was, how she'd come to be on that road, where she'd gone after. Elena answered them plainly and without ornament, the same way she'd answered everything her entire life, and somewhere in the middle of the second cup of coffee, she became aware that the thing she'd been holding in her chest for 8 years, the specific, particular weight of having done something that mattered to people who didn't know it was her, had shifted in its housing and become something different. Not lighter, not gone. Just differently placed, the way a stone moves when water gets under it. August Whitmore left with a quiet handshake and the promise to check in before they moved on from Copperfield. Margaret, at the door, turned back and said, with the directness that was entirely her own, I'm going to tell my children about you someday. Elena didn't know what to say to that. All right, she said. Just so you know, Margaret said, and walked out. The weeks that followed were the strangest Elena had spent in Copperfield, which was saying something given the preceding 4 months. The town was conducting a slow and visible reckoning with itself, which it did in the way small towns always do. Privately, in increments, without anyone formally announcing that a position had changed. Mrs. Hennessy stopped crossing the street. She did not come and speak to Elena directly, but she stopped crossing the street, which was the nearest thing to an apology a woman of her type was likely to produce. Old Pete at the feed store, who had always been decent, became actively warm. He started setting aside good cuts of salt pork when his delivery came in, and telling Elena they'd been claimed by a regular customer, which was a fiction so obvious it was practically affectionate. Tom Carew was another matter. Tom Carew did not change. He was the kind of man who had built his sense of himself around being practical, and being practical meant the Copperfield that suited his business interests, and that Copperfield required Harlan Doss to remain the largest operator in the county with the fewest complications. He could not, without dismantling something essential about how he understood himself, simply revise his position. So he didn't. He was civil to Elena when he had to be, and otherwise behaved as though she were a fixture in a building he'd decided not to redecorate. Gideon watched Tom Carew and said nothing for 2 weeks, and then said, "To Elena, over supper." Carew met with Doss's lawyer yesterday, at the hotel in Millhaven. "How do you know?" Elena said. "Walt Pierce's cousin works the hotel dining room," Gideon said. He recognized both of them. What were they discussing? Unknown, but Doss's lawyer doesn't come to Millhaven for social calls. Elena was quiet. "The circuit court deadline," she said. Ames gave 30 days for Doss to provide his own accounting of the survey discrepancies. "That's 11 days away," Gideon said. "Doss is going to respond," Elena said. "And however he responds, Carew is involved." "Yes," Gideon said. She thought about this while she washed the dishes, which she still did not because it was her job, but because she thought better with her hands occupied. The question was how Doss would play it. He had several options. He could try to discredit the documentation, argue that the survey discrepancies were genuine errors produced by standard surveying imprecision rather than deliberate fraud. He could try to discredit the witnesses, the Pierce brothers, who could be characterized as disgruntled farmers with a financial grievance. He could try to discredit the reviewing judge's jurisdiction by claiming the matter was a county issue rather than a circuit one. Or he could try to discredit Elena. She set the last dish in the rack and dried her hands. "He's going to come for the ledger," she said. Gideon was at the table. He looked up. "You think he's going to argue the documentation is inadmissible?" "I think he's going to argue that a written record compiled by a woman of," she used Pitts's language deliberately, "disreputable character and no verified history is not credible evidence, that it's self-serving, that I had reasons to damage Doss that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the saloon closure he petitioned for." "His lawyer will argue that," Gideon said. "Yes, I've been thinking the same thing." "But now there's the Whitmore statement in the public record," Elena said, "and August Whitmore is available to testify if needed. And the argument that I'm a woman with an unverified background—" She stopped. "It doesn't hold the same way it did before." "No," Gideon said, "it doesn't." "Which is why Carew met with the lawyer," Elena said. "They're recalibrating their approach to the ledger, not abandoning it." "What do you think they'll do instead?" Elena turned to face him. "They'll argue that the written record is selective, that I recorded what I remembered, but memory is not documentation, that without corroborating witnesses to the specific conversations," she paused. "And they're not entirely wrong about that. The ledger is strong where we have external documents to confirm the content. It's weaker on the conversations that only I heard. Like the Reeves and Calder conversations about Fitch," Gideon said. "Yes," she said. "Those are mine alone." He drummed his fingers once on the table. "Is there anyone else who was in that room regularly enough to confirm any of it? Any of the other women who worked at the Dusty Rose?" Elena thought about this seriously, the way she thought about anything she wasn't sure of. "Ruby Sands might remember the Reeves conversation," she said slowly. "She was working the north end of the bar that night. I don't know if she heard it directly, but she might have noticed the men being there." "Where's Ruby Sands now?" "Millhaven," Elena said. "She went with the group that left the night the Dusty Rose closed." "Could you write to her?" "I can try." She pulled the chair out and sat down across from him. "She might not want to be involved. People who leave situations like that generally leave them entirely." "I understand," Gideon said. "But worth asking." Elena wrote to Ruby Sands that night. She kept the letter plain and honest. "Here's what's happening. Here's what I remember. Here's what might help. I'm not asking you to do anything that puts you at risk. You get to decide." She sealed it, and Gideon wrote it to the Millhaven postal office himself the following morning. The response came back in 9 days. Not from Ruby. From a woman named Cecilia Moore, who had also worked at the Dusty Rose, and whom Elena had been less close to, but whom Ruby had apparently told about the letter. Cecilia wrote 3 pages in handwriting that leaned hard to the right and covered both sides of the paper. She remembered the Tuesday nights. She remembered Reeves and Calder as regulars. She specifically remembered an evening. She dated it in her memory as the spring before the closure, when Reeves had been agitated about a land complaint and Calder had told him something that settled him down, something about documentation being already handled. She hadn't understood it at the time. She hadn't needed to. Elena read the letter twice. Then she handed it to Gideon without comment. He read it. He was quiet for a long moment. "This corroborates the general timeline," he said. "Yes," Elena said. "Not the specific conversation, but the pattern of behavior, the men, the time frame. It's enough to establish that these conversations weren't something I invented." "Will you ask her to make a formal statement?" "I'll ask," Elena said. "She gets to decide." Cecilia Moore, when asked, agreed to make a statement. She signed it before a notary in Millhaven, and Gideon retrieved it on a Thursday afternoon and added it to the file, which was now thick enough that it required its own box. Doss's response to Judge Ames came in on the 30th day, arriving at the circuit court and simultaneously, through channels Elena didn't entirely understand, at Gideon's office via a courtesy copy. It was 40 pages long, written by a lawyer named Bertrand Hollis, who worked out of the Capitol and whose name Gideon recognized from 2 other land cases in adjacent counties. They read it together at the kitchen table, passing pages back and forth. Elena faster than Gideon because she read faster, Gideon going back and rereading sections she'd already passed him while she moved ahead. It took most of an evening. Hollis was good. Elena gave him that without resentment. A competent adversary was at least a clean problem. The argument was exactly what she'd predicted, and built with care. The surveys were the work of a licensed professional whose methods were standard for the period. The discrepancies reflected the inherent imprecision of frontier surveying rather than deliberate manipulation. The property transfers had been conducted in good faith based on legally recorded boundaries. The primary evidence against this position was a self-compiled written document produced by a woman with a documented history of association with a disreputable establishment and a personal grievance against the client, corroborated by farmhands and former saloon workers, whose own credibility was minimal at best. And then, in the final 8 pages, Hollis did something Elena had not entirely predicted. He went after Gideon. Not loudly. Hollis was too good for loud. Quietly, with the particular efficiency of a man who has been told where to cut and cuts precisely. The deputy had pursued this inquiry not out of a neutral professional obligation, but out of a personal and domestic attachment to the primary witness whose account he had every reason to protect. The relationship between the deputy and the woman whose testimony formed the foundation of the inquiry represented a conflict of interest that rendered the entire investigation compromised from its inception. The circuit court should, in fairness to all parties, consider whether a case built by an interested party on testimony produced in his own residence could be regarded as impartially assembled. Elena finished reading and set the last page down. Gideon finished 30 seconds later. He also set his pages down. He looked at the table. "He's not wrong that it's a conflict," Gideon said, after a moment. "He's arguing the conflict invalidates the evidence," Elena said. "That's different." "I know, but Elena—" He stopped. "If Ames decides that the connection between us is close enough to constitute bias, he could set the whole file aside, request an independent review. Which would take how long?" "Months, maybe longer." He rubbed the back of his neck. "And in the meantime, Doss continues operating." Elena was quiet. She was looking at Hollis's language, personal and domestic attachment. The relationship between the deputy and the woman. It was careful phrasing. It didn't say anything that could be characterized as false. It simply arranged the truth in the most damaging available order. "What does Calloway say?" she asked. "I haven't talked to Calloway yet." "You need to," she said. "Before Hollis's filing gets to him through another channel. You need to talk to him directly." "I know," Gideon said. "And you need to decide something," Elena said. She looked at him directly. Whether the conflict argument has any weight depends on how Ames characterizes our arrangement. If we're... She stopped. If the arrangement is what it is, two people living in the same house, Gideon said. Yes. If that's what it is, then Hollis's argument has some traction. A deputy and his material witness who share a roof. She looked at the table. It's not enough to throw the case out, but it's enough to muddy it. And if the arrangement is something else, Gideon said. His voice was careful, entirely even. Then it's still a conflict, Elena said. But it's a different kind of conflict, and it's documented differently. They looked at each other across the table. The lamp was on. The kitchen had the particular quality it had at the end of long evenings. The fire lower, the papers spread between them, the outside world reduced to wind and the creak of the house settling. Elena, Gideon said. Don't say it because of Hollis's filing, she said. I'm not, he said. I've been thinking about saying it for 6 weeks. Hollis just made tonight the night. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking you to marry me. Not for the case, not for the conflict argument, because I want you to stay. And I should have said that plainly instead of telling you the room had a bed and a window. Elena was quiet for a long moment. The window sticks, she said. I fixed it, he said. Mostly, she said. Elena. She looked at him. Gideon Hale, who had picked up her bag without asking and said, come home and eat supper, and had never once told her what to do or who to be, or what her scar meant about her character. Who read slowly and apologized when he was wrong, and had cold anger instead of hot, and drank her coffee when his was too far away and was not a perfect man in any direction. Yes, she said, but I'm finishing the ledger first. Obviously, he said. She pulled the ledger toward her. He pulled the Hollis filing toward him and picked up his pen. Outside, December held the ridge in the dark, and the wind found the gap under the door where the rag had shifted, and neither of them got up to fix it because there was still work to do and the night was long enough to hold all of it. Gideon talked to Calloway the next morning. He went early, before the office filled with the ordinary business of the day, and he closed the door behind him, which was not something he usually did. Calloway looked at the closed door and then at Gideon and reached for his coffee cup with the deliberate motion of a man bracing himself. I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else, Gideon said. All right, Calloway said. I asked Elena Ashcroft to marry me last night, Gideon said. She accepted. Calloway was quiet for a moment. He set down his cup. He looked at Gideon with the expression of a man running a calculation that had more variables than he'd anticipated. You understand what Hollis is going to do with that, he said. Hollis is going to argue that I proposed in response to his conflict filing, Gideon said, which is partly true. The timing is what it is, but the decision isn't. I've been living in the same house as this woman for 4 months, and I know her character, and I know what I want. He looked at Calloway directly. What I'm telling you is that whatever conflict exists between my personal situation and this inquiry, it's now on record and disclosed. I'm not hiding it. I'm telling you, and I'm prepared to tell Judge Ames. Calloway rubbed his face. Gideon, I know. This gives Hollis exactly the ammunition he needs to argue. It gives Hollis an argument, Gideon said. It doesn't give him the truth. The truth is that the documentation we've assembled stands on its own. The ledger, the Pierce statements, Cecilia Moore's account, the survey analysis, none of that changes because of who I'm marrying. He leaned forward slightly. Calloway, 7 families, 4 of them gone. You know what Doss has been doing. You've known it for longer than I have. Calloway was very still. You've known, Gideon said more quietly, and you've been in a position that made it easier not to act on what you knew. I understand that. I'm not here to litigate your choices. I'm here because Judge Ames is going to want to hear from you about whether this inquiry was conducted properly, and I need to know which side of that conversation you're going to be on. The silence in Calloway's office was the kind that has texture, the sound of a man deciding something he should have decided a long time ago and was only now getting around to because the cost of not deciding had finally exceeded the cost of choosing. The inquiry was conducted properly, Calloway said finally. He said it flatly, without drama, the way a practical man states a fact. I'll say that to Ames if he asks. Gideon picked up his hat. That's all I needed, he said. He was at the door when Calloway said, Gideon? He turned. Calloway looked at his desk rather than at him. The conduct complaint, he said. Against your position. I'm withdrawing it. On what grounds? On the grounds that it was filed under pressure from an interested party, and I should have said that at the time. He still wasn't looking at Gideon. I'm noting that in the withdrawal. Gideon looked at him for a moment. Thank you, he said. He walked out into the December morning, which was cold enough to see his breath and bright in the particular way of winter light that has nowhere to hide. He stood on the step for a moment and looked at the street, Tom Carew's hardware store, the milliner's, the post office, the whole small accumulated fact of Copperfield, and felt something settle in him that had been braced for a long time. He rode home and told Elena. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened to everything important. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, Calloway's withdrawing the complaint on record. Yes. That's significant, she said, because it establishes that the complaint was improperly filed, which means the cloud it was designed to put over the inquiry was also improper, which Ames will see. That's what I thought too, Gideon said. She looked at him. You handled that well. I just told him the truth, Gideon said. Most people can't do that, Elena said. Don't undersell it. He sat down. She poured coffee. The morning moved forward the way mornings did in that house, with work, with paper, with the occasional exchange that was half practical and half something they were both still learning to navigate. They were engaged to be married, and they were also in the middle of the most significant legal proceeding either of them had ever been part of, and these two facts lived together in the kitchen without particular ceremony because there was no other place to put them. Judge Harland Ames requested a formal hearing for the second week of January. The notice arrived on a Friday. It was addressed to Gideon as the filing deputy, but included Elena's name as supplementary witness in documentation, and it requested that all original materials be available for examination. The hearing would be conducted in Millhaven at the circuit courthouse. Both parties, meaning Gideon's inquiry and Doss's response, were expected to present. Elena read the notice 3 times. January 14th, she said. 3 weeks, Gideon said. Hollis will be there. Yes. He's good, Elena said. Not worried, just accurate. So are you, Gideon said. And you have 240 pages of dated, cross-referenced documentation that he's going to have to work very hard to discredit. He'll try, Elena said. Let him try, Gideon said. She looked at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and there was something in his expression that was not quite confidence and not quite stubbornness, but occupied the space between them. The look of a man who has made a decision and means to hold it. She went back to the ledger. There were things she wanted to add. Tighter cross-references, a summary index she'd been putting off writing because indices were tedious work that she kept displacing with more immediately satisfying tasks. She wrote the index. It took 3 days and was 40 pages on its own. Gideon, looking at it, said it was probably the most organized document he had ever seen in a legal context, which she accepted as a factual observation rather than a compliment. The week before the hearing, 2 things happened. The first was that Ruby Sands wrote back. Her letter had been a long time coming, 12 days from Millhaven, which suggested she had started it and stopped it at least once before sending. The letter itself was short. She said she remembered the Reeves and Calder nights. She said she remembered a specific incident in which Reeves had spread a survey map on the bar and shown Calder a boundary line and said something about the line being movable if you knew the right man to move it. She said she hadn't understood it at the time. She said she wasn't willing to make a formal statement because she had a position at a reputable boarding house in Millhaven and wasn't prepared to invite scrutiny of her own past, and she hoped Elena would understand that. Elena did understand. She wrote back and said so, and thanked Ruby without asking again. But she kept the letter, and she wrote a separate document summarizing the information it contained, noting clearly that it was unsworn and hearsay, and added it to the file as background rather than evidence. Gideon looked at it and said he thought Ames might find the pattern it described useful context, even without a sworn account behind it. Background, Elena said, not evidence. Background that establishes a consistent pattern of behavior, he said. Ames will know what to do with it. The second thing that happened was Harlan Doss coming to the house himself. It was a Tuesday evening, 6 days before the hearing. Elena was in the garden. Not gardening, just standing, the way she sometimes stood in the cold air when she needed to think, without walls around her. She saw the horse before she recognized the rider, and then she recognized the rider and was still. Doss dismounted at the gate. He was 63 years old and had the build of a man who had worked hard when he was young and had since acquired the authority that made working hard someone else's problem. He wore a good coat and a hat that had cost more than most men in Copperfield earned in a month. He looked across the fence at Elena with an expression that was not quite what she'd expected. She had expected cold. She got something closer to tired. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Mr. Doss," she said. He looked at the house. "Hale in?" "He'll be back within the hour," she said. She did not invite him in. She did not move from where she was standing. "If you'd like to wait." "I'll say what I've come to say," Doss said. He looked at the fence between them rather than at her. "Hollis tells me the hearing isn't going to go well." Elena said nothing. "He says the documentation is substantial and the judge is unlikely to be sympathetic." Doss looked up at her. "He also says the Whitmore statement in the public record makes the character angle difficult to maintain." "Difficult," Elena said. "His word," Doss said, "not mine." She looked at him. He was not a stupid man. She had always known that. Stupid men made simple messes. Harlan Doss had made a complicated, long-running, carefully organized one, which required intelligence even if it didn't require anything resembling conscience. "What is it you want to say, Mr. Doss?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to say that what I did to those families—" He stopped. He looked at the fence post. "I want to say it wasn't personal. The land was valuable and the method was available and I used it." "I know," Elena said. "That's the part that's hardest to explain to people. That it wasn't personal. That it was just business." She kept her voice even. "The Murphys lost their water rights. They moved to their daughter's place in Kansas and the father died the following winter. The Pierce brothers have spent 3 years in a boundary dispute that's cost them 6 months of grazing season." She paused. "It wasn't personal to you, it was entirely personal to them." Doss was quiet. "I'm not telling you what to feel about it," Elena said. "I'm just telling you what it was." He looked at her for a long moment. He had expected something, coming here. She wasn't sure what. Maybe he had expected her to be smaller in person than she'd been in his imagination. People often came to confront her expecting something they didn't find. "I intend to offer full restitution on 4 of the 7 properties," he said, "and to release the disputed boundary claims on the Pierce parcel and 2 others. My lawyer will file the framework with the circuit court before the hearing." Elena stared at him. "Not because Hollis told me to," Doss said preemptively. "Hollis told me to fight it. I'm doing this because—" He stopped again. He seemed genuinely uncertain how to finish the sentence, which was probably the most human thing Elena had seen from him. "Because it's been long enough," he said. "The 4 families who are gone," Elena said. "You can restore the land record. You can't restore what they lost in the meantime." "No," he said. "I can't." "I know," she said. "I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying do it knowing that." He nodded. Once, stiffly, the way men nod when they are accepting something they cannot make more comfortable by arguing with it. "The petition for the Dusty Rose," Elena said. He looked up. "The 17 signatures," she said. "Some of them were forged." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to confess to it tonight," she said. "I'm telling you that I know, and that Judge Ames is going to know, and that when you file your restitution framework, you should consider including an honest account of the petition." Doss's jaw moved slightly. That's outside what Hollis told you to do," she said. "Yes, I know." She held his eyes. "You're doing this because it's been long enough, so do it completely." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to his horse and mounted without another word and rode back the direction he'd come. Elena stood in the cold garden and watched him go and did not feel the satisfaction she might have expected. She felt mostly tired. and underneath the tired, the particular kind of grief that comes from watching someone acknowledge something too late for it to be entirely useful. She went inside and put water on and sat down at the kitchen table and was still sitting there when Gideon came home 40 minutes later and found her with her hands wrapped around a cold cup and a look on her face that made him stop in the doorway. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened to the things that mattered. When she finished, he sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment. "He's going to file restitution before the hearing," Gideon said. "Yes." "That changes the hearing significantly." "Yes," she said. "Ames still needs to establish the record. But if Doss is filing an acknowledgement before they even start, the hearing becomes a process of formalizing something that's already been admitted, rather than a fight over whether it happened." "That's better for the families," Gideon said. "That's what matters," Elena said. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" She considered that honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I thought I'd feel something when it moved toward ending. I thought it would feel more—" She stopped. "He said it wasn't personal, that it was just the land and the method was available." She turned the cup. "And the terrible thing is, I believe him. I don't think he thought about those families as people very much. I think he thought about them as obstacles. And that's—" She stopped again. "Worse," Gideon said. "In a way," she said. "Yes, malice is at least a form of acknowledgement. This was just— they didn't matter enough to think about." Gideon didn't offer her anything easy. He didn't say it would be all right, or that justice was being served, or any of the things a person says when they want a difficult conversation to arrive somewhere comfortable. He just sat across from her in the kitchen that had been his kitchen and had become their kitchen without either of them formally announcing the transition, and he was present, which was what she needed more than anything philosophical. After a while, she got up and reheated the water and made fresh coffee, and they talked about the hearing, the practical things, what they needed to bring, how the index would be organized, what order to present the documentation. By the time they went to bed, the conversation had become something she could hold without flinching, which was not the same as it being easy, but was close enough. The hearing before Judge Harlan Ames lasted 2 days. It was not the dramatic confrontation that Copperfield, when word got back, would later describe in the retelling. It was a proceeding, methodical, documented, with long stretches of procedural language and the particular atmosphere of a formal room in which people are expected to be precise. Hollis presented Doss's case. Gideon presented the inquiry documentation. Elena sat at the table beside Gideon with the ledger and the index and 240 pages of careful memory and answered every question put to her without embellishment and without flinching. Hollis questioned her for 4 hours across the 2 days. He was professional about it. He had stopped being personally disparaging once the Whitmore statement entered the public record, because that particular ground had shifted under him and he was too good a lawyer to keep standing on it. Instead, he focused on methodology, the reliability of memory, the potential for selective recall, the absence of sworn corroboration for specific conversations. Elena answered him the way she had prepared to answer him, by acknowledging, clearly and without defensiveness, the distinction between what she knew and what she remembered, between what was corroborated by documents and what rested on her account alone, and by pointing, each time he raised a question, to the specific cross-reference in the index that connected her account to an external record. On the second afternoon, Ames asked her a direct question. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. He was a man who looked as Gideon had described him, 60-something, methodical, with the slightly distant expression of someone who has been listening carefully to people under pressure for a very long time and has learned to separate what they say from how they feel about saying it. "You compiled this record over several months while living in the residence of the investigating deputy. How do you respond to the suggestion that the record reflects a personal interest in the outcome of this inquiry?" Elena looked at him steadily. "I'd say that personal interest and accuracy are not mutually exclusive," she said. "I had a personal interest in this outcome because I believe what was done to those families was wrong. The fact that I cared about the outcome doesn't change what I heard or what I remembered. It changed how carefully I recorded it." She paused. "I would also say that the people most affected by the land fraud, the families who lost property, had a far greater personal interest in the outcome than I did. If personal interest invalidated testimony, you wouldn't have witnesses. Ames looked at her for a long moment. He said nothing. The index cross-references every disputed entry to an external document, Elena said. Where my account cannot be cross-referenced, I've noted that explicitly. I have not claimed more certainty than I have. I've tried to give you a record that can be checked. She held his eyes. Check it. That's what it's for. Ames made a note. He asked 3 more questions about specific entries in the ledger. Elena answered them. He thanked her and called the next procedural item. Doss did not attend the hearing in person. Hollis presented his filing framework and the restitution offer on his behalf. Ames received it, read it, and asked Hollis 4 questions about the scope of the restitution and whether it encompassed all 7 properties or the 4 Doss had initially offered. By the end of the second afternoon, under Ames's methodical pressure, Hollis had extended the framework to all 7. Gideon, walking out of the courthouse on the second evening, said nothing for a full 5 minutes. Then he said, All 7. All 7? Elena said. He came in offering 4, Gideon said. Ames is good at his job, Elena said. So are you, Gideon said. That answer you gave him, about personal interest. It's just true, she said. That's what made it good, he said. They walked to where the horses were tied. The January air was cold enough to make her eyes water slightly, and the street in Millhaven was busy in the late afternoon way of a county seat that didn't stop just because a significant legal proceeding had concluded. A woman came out of a shop with packages. 2 men argued in front of the bank. A child ran past and nearly hit Elena's elbow and didn't apologize and kept running. The ordinary world continuing. Ames issued his formal ruling 3 weeks later. It was 8 pages, dense with legal language, and the summary of it was this. The survey filings of J.W. Aldous on behalf of interests associated with Harlan Doss were found to contain systematic irregularities inconsistent with standard surveying practice and consistent with deliberate boundary manipulation. All 7 affected property records were ordered corrected. Restitution proceedings were to be conducted under circuit court supervision. Aldous's surveying license was referred to the licensing board for review. The conduct of the inquiry was found to be properly documented, and the evidentiary record was accepted in full. The complaint against Gideon's position, already withdrawn by Calloway, was noted in the ruling as having been filed under circumstances that raised questions about the motivations of the filer, which Ames described in careful legal language as a matter the county commissioner's office should review internally. Tom Carew read the ruling in the Copperfield Weekly, which Horace Pitts printed in its entirety on the front page, possibly because he had finally calculated which side of the story was going to be remembered. Tom Carew read it and came into the hardware store on a Thursday morning and said nothing to anyone for the rest of the day. He did not apologize to Elena. She had not expected him to and was not waiting for it. J.W. Aldous surrendered his license in February rather than face the board review. He left the county. Nobody saw Harlan Doss at the county commissioner's building after January. He still owned his land, the legally obtained portions of it, and still ran his cattle on it, but the cooperative was dissolved and Reeves and Calder both found other employment before spring. The Pierce brothers got their strip of eastern pasture back in March. Walt Pierce rode into Copperfield, tied his horse outside the deputy's office, and came into the kitchen where Elena was writing a letter and said, without preamble, "It's done." Then he shook her hand, but she, not Gideon's first, hers, and left. She stood at the window and watched him ride away. Of the 7 families, 4 had moved too far and built too much elsewhere to return, but 2 came back. The Hendersons, who had sold under pressure 3 years earlier and moved to their son's farm, returned in April and began rebuilding. A family named Corrigan, who had lost a water rights dispute and spent 2 years leasing land they'd previously owned, quietly filed their corrected deed in May and started fencing their own property again. Elena did not make a ceremony of any of this. The work had been the ceremony. The ledger, the index, the 4 hours across from Hollis in the circuit courthouse, that was where the significant thing had happened. The results were just the results arriving in their own time. They were married in the last week of December, 1 year almost to the day after Elena had stood in the hollow doorway of the Dusty Rose with a canvas bag and a wool coat and nowhere to go. The ceremony was short. A justice of the peace, a cold afternoon, 2 witnesses who were Walt Pierce and August Whitmore, who happened to be passing back through Copperfield on business and had been asked with a week's notice and had come without hesitation. Margaret Whitmore stood at the back of the small room in her good coat and watched with the focused attention she brought to everything. Afterward, she told Elena, in the direct way she had that was entirely her own, that she was glad this was how it had ended. "This isn't the ending," Elena said. "It's just where the first part stops." Margaret considered that. "That's a better way to say it," she said. The house was the same house it had always been, unpainted, 2 stories, with the ridgeline visible from the front porch on clear days, and a garden that now had a proper fence and a productive set of tomato beds that Elena had expanded in the spring. The kitchen still had the gap under the door where the weather got in. Gideon had stuffed a better rag into it, which helped, but the house was old and the cold found its way in regardless, and they had both decided that this was the house's character and not worth fighting anymore. Elena still woke early. She still made coffee before anyone else was moving and sat at the kitchen table in the half-light with the ledger. A different one now, a new one, because the old one was in a box at the circuit court as part of the permanent record. The new one was for other things: correspondence, notes, the running record of a life that had not finished generating things worth writing down. She thought sometimes about what the town of Copperfield had believed about her for 6 years, and what it believed now, and what the distance between those 2 things said about the way people understand each other. She did not think it said anything flattering. People had been wrong about her not because they were cruel. Most of them weren't cruel, or weren't only cruel, but because it was easier to accept a category than to investigate a person. She was the category first. She was the person after, and only after something happened that forced them to look more carefully. She did not know how to change that about people. She was not sure it could be changed exactly. What she knew was that the version of herself that had worked in a saloon for 6 years, invisible, careful, watching and remembering, that version of herself had not been waiting to be discovered. She had not been surviving in order to be vindicated. She had been living in the only way available to her at the time, and she had done it with as much intention as she could bring to bear on it. The vindication was a consequence, not the point. The point had always been the same: 2 children in a burning building, 7 families who deserved their land, the specific ordinary work of people living alongside each other in a place they were trying to make into something worth staying in. That was the thing about justice, she had come to understand. It didn't announce itself. It arrived in the form of a surveyor's license being surrendered, a strip of eastern pasture being returned, a family coming back to start again in April. It arrived in the form of Walt Pierce shaking her hand instead of Gideon's, which was a small thing that meant something enormous. It was not a great moment in a courthouse. It was everything that came after, in the ordinary wait of days. Gideon came downstairs one February morning and found her at the table with the new ledger and a cup of coffee and the light coming off the ridge through the kitchen window in the thin, clear way of winter light that had no warmth but had excellent visibility. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said. He got his own coffee and sat down across from her. He was still in the slightly rumpled state of a man who had been asleep 20 minutes ago, which was not a distinguished look and which he was completely unbothered by, which was one of the things she had come to rely on about him, his absolute indifference to being seen before he was ready. "What are you writing?" he said. "Notes," she said. "On what?" She looked at the page. She had been writing about the Corrigan family, about the day they'd come back and started fencing, and what it looked like from the road. She had not told anyone she was writing it. It was not a legal document. It was just the fact of it, recorded, the way she recorded things, because things that weren't recorded had a way of becoming uncertain, and she had spent enough of her life in the territory of uncertain things. "The families," she said. "What happened to them after?" Gideon looked at her over his coffee cup. "All of them?" "The ones I can account for," she said. He nodded slowly. He did not ask why, because he knew why. It was the same reason she had built the index, the same reason she had written the ledger in the first place. Because the record was how you held on to things. Because a thing that happened and was not written down was a thing that the world could arrange to forget. Outside, the February wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge, and the light was getting stronger in the kitchen window, and somewhere in the barn the horse was beginning to be audible in the way of animals that know the morning has started, even if the people haven't caught up yet. Elena turned the page and kept writing. There are people in every place and time who do the significant thing without an audience and then live the years after it without recognition, and the world mostly never adjusts its understanding of them to account for what they actually are. This is not a tragedy, exactly. It is just the ordinary arithmetic of how people are seen, which has always favored the visible over the genuine. Elena Ashcroft had been invisible for 6 years in a room full of people, and she had used the invisibility, and she had built something out of it that lasted longer than the silence did. What she had understood, that cold evening when Gideon picked up her bag without asking, what she had understood but couldn't have named yet, was that the sentence that would change her life wasn't going to be a declaration or a rescue. It was going to be ordinary. It was going to be a practical offer from a practical man with an empty room and a workable idea. Come home and eat supper. Not, I see who you are. Not, I know what you're worth. Just, come home. Just, eat supper. Just the smallest possible version of a door opening, which was all it took, because she had never needed someone to save her. She had needed someone to open the door far enough for her to walk through it herself. She had done the rest. The coffee went cold while she wrote. She didn't notice until Gideon got up and refilled her cup without being asked, and set it down in front of her and went to look out the window at the ridge, and she said, without looking up, "Thank you." And he said, "The Henderson place has smoke coming from the chimney again," which meant they were back and settled and the stove was working. "Good," Elena said. "Good," Gideon agreed. She turned the page and wrote that down too.